In this edition of New England Authors, we dig into two of my favorite subjects, history and bicycling. Lorenz Finison has explored the subject better than anyone, from those high wheelers on poor dirt roads in the 1880s to the absolute dominance of cars on highways to the mushrooming of bicycling today. Well, Larry Finison, Lorenz Finison, welcome to New England Authors. You've got two books out about Boston's bicycling history, and you cover not just Boston, but a lot of the region around here. I imagine you're an enthusiast, a bicycle enthusiast?
I love bicycling, and the extent to which I can do it at my age, I continue to do it. Love
Excellent,
it.
excellent.
But I also love history.
And
put the two together.
You're right with me as well. So you went through a lot of historical research. I read the books, and there's a lot of details in here, although when you read the book, it doesn't feel like you're reading details. How did you do this research? Did you go through archives, newspapers? What did you do?
I went through a lot of archives. I went through newspaper clippings that I was able to get from the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald and a raft of other newspapers and magazines that were around both during the 1880s, 1890s, and all the way up to the present time. And it was a tremendous labor of that kind of research, but it also involved a lot of genealogy, because I was convinced, and it turned out to be true, that some of the descendants of these cyclists from the 1890s, for example, were still around town. And they had photographs and diaries and all kinds of things in their family archives, and were able to show those with me. So I was very pleased.
It must have been a lot of fun to go and talk to people like that.
It was a lot of fun to do it, and in some cases it was hard to get a hold of them, and I had to kind of cold call, step up to their doorway, knock on the door and say, I'm so-and-so, and looking for something about this ancestor of yours that died 100 years ago. And the good news is that I feel very privileged that I was able to, in about 95% of the cases, get good cooperation.
Excellent,
so that felt great.
I'm sure you did. But tell us, when did bicycling come to the United States and how?
Well, it first came in 1878. 1877, 1878 were the first bicyclists in Boston, and by 1878 there was the first bicycling club in Boston called the Boston Bicycling Club, and it was first in the nation.
Did it come from France or what?
It came from England, essentially. The early cyclists in Boston, some of them were actually English who had come over here, and they had very strong ties still, and since there was bicycling in England earlier, they really brought it with them.
And so we're talking about the big wheel.
Yeah, the big wheel kind of bike. And then shortly after...
Have you ever ridden one?
I've never ridden one, and I probably never will.
No.
But they were difficult to get up on. Once you got up on them, they were pretty stable. And you were all set until you hit a rock in the road, and then you might go right over the handlebars, and it was a long ways down.
Yeah. And how long did they last? When did people start thinking about gearing?
In the late 1880s and the early 1890s, they began to develop what was called the safety bicycle, which looks very similar to what we have now. And it had gearing, and it had brakes, and it had pneumatic tires, and all the kinds of things that we're really dependent on now. And people really made the transition within a space of about 3-4 years. They discovered that was a much better way to go. And the old-timey high-wheelers just went out of business pretty much.
Yeah. Now, your book is, your first book is Bicycling Craze.
Yes.
So it must have been a craze until 1900.
It was. It was a tremendous craze all over the country. Boston was in the lead. And first bicycle club, and a real development here of bicycle manufacturers, and first in the League of American Wheelmen.
Yes.
The highest percentage of women members in the League of American Wheelmen. And so it was Boston was really in the lead.
So women were involved. What about, was it exclusive for rich people? I mean, you had to have some money to buy this.
Well, it's certainly in the early 1880s, it certainly started out as a gentleman's sport.
Right.
And they were very explicit about that. For example, people who were professional cyclists, professional racers, were not allowed into the Boston Bicycle Club. And they were very explicit about it. They wanted this to be a gentleman's pursuit. Yeah. And in fact, they, at that time, didn't admit women into it. And that particular club never did. As long as it lived, up until the 1950s, it never had any women members.
Interesting, interesting, interesting. You show a map, you show a lot of illustrations in your book, and one of the maps is of eastern New England with its many roads. Now, this was something that the League of American Wheelmen fought for, was the Good Roads campaign. Can you talk a little about that?
Absolutely did. The cyclists from Boston wanted to get out into the rural areas for a wonderful, not only a wonderful country ride, but also a way to get away from the city. If you think about the city at that time, it was a huge metropolis. It was very immigrant rich. It tended to be polluted and I think
horse manure.
Exactly, all of that. The river was enormously polluted at the time. And so to get away from the immigrants and the smells of the city, they wanted to go far out into the countryside, but that required them to have good roads. And so their first campaign was a good roads movement.
And what they used the kind of the trails of horses and coaches and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, there were country roads at the time, and but they were very in very bad shape, particularly the rural roads around the farm country around Boston. And they needed an improvement if they were going to be able to bicycle on them very well, especially in muddy weather.
Yeah, what did they do to try to smooth them in somehow?
Well, they developed various things like macadam roads and hard stone roads in order to be able to bicycle on them better.
And they had initial asphalt as well, right?
Well, they had some asphalt, but that wasn't the major part of the roadways. They were more like hardened stone dust roads. Right. That would be one thing. Or they were simple dirt roads, and those were the ones that got enormously muddy in the seasons where you would expect that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've ridden on my share of dirt roads. So they advocated for good roads. Where the bicycles were a bit expensive, right? So
they sure were.
Yeah, were they more expensive than a horse, for example, do you think?
I wouldn't say they were necessarily more expensive than a horse, but they cost up to $3,000 in today's terms. So this was not a sport for at least the high wheelers weren't a sport for the ordinary citizen.
Yeah. Did they have any lanterns or anything like that?
Some of them had lanterns, and there are many advertisements in the old newspapers and magazines for lanterns. And there was a great struggle within the biking community and within the legislature in terms of regulation of bicycles. And one of the regulations that the cyclists resisted was to have lanterns. And they argued back that if we have to have lanterns, then horses and carriages should have lanterns and be required to, and pedestrians too, so that we don't run into them. And finally, the whole thing kind of collapsed.
You're listening to New England Authors. We're speaking with Larry Finison. He's written a couple of books about bicycling and bicycling history. I love bicycling, and we're going through the historical record here from the 1878 when bicycles first came to the New England area, and then there was this mushrooming of bicycling, the craze of bicycling, until 1900, and then what happened?
Well, there was a big collapse.
Yes.
And part of the collapse had to do with the fact that bicycling kind of lost its chic. because the prices dropped on bicycles and the safety bicycles became so popular. So many people got involved in it that the old gentlemen of the Boston Bicycle Club would go out into the countryside and they would find groups like the Boston Italian Wheelmen would be following them out there, or the black cycling clubs or the women's cycling clubs. So it was no longer an opportunity to get away from the city, since the city followed them out into the countryside. And they eventually kind of gave up on cycling, many of them, and it lost its chic, and they went off into other pursuits like motorcycles and ultimately automobiles and the country clubs and whatnot.
So if I got this straight, it was something for pleasure, not for transportation.
It was mainly for pleasure, although some people also commuted to work, and certainly there was a lot of racing that went on during that time. So three prongs, just as we have it today, which was racing, commuting, and recreational.
I see. So then, because the bicycling died out, the manufacturers thought of some good ways to keep in business. What did they do?
They started marketing to the child.
Yeah.
And that went on for a number of years, probably 30 years, until the 1930s. They had almost given up on the adult market. And then the adult market began to come back in the 1930s at a time when the manufacturer said, well, maybe we can get college students to ride a bit.
Yeah.
And then they developed the whole notion around Boston here and elsewhere too of the bike trains, which were started in 1935 with the trains out of North Station that took bicyclists up into the mountains in New Hampshire and let them free for a day to go bicycling around, then get back in and get back to Boston. Similarly, from South Station, or actually from New York, they would come up to Western Connecticut and Western Massachusetts, and they would bike around that area and then go back to New York again. And I often call that like a singles dating club on wheels, which is really, in a sense, how it functioned during that time. That was in the mid to late 30s.
So, but you also say that it became dangerous because they had to share the road with cars.
Well,
right?
and cars were increasingly numerous and increasingly fast and increasingly clogged the roads, so it was very dangerous for cyclists, and that became even worse during the 1950s.
Tell us about the American Youth Hostels. They played a part in this story.
They certainly did. That was one of the encouragements to ride during the 1930s. They had an opportunity, young folks did, high school students, college students, to get out and go through and bicycle to a whole series of youth hostels all over New England, and in fact in other parts of the country and Canada as well. So you could go off for a week and spend a couple of dollars a night at most to have a place to stay, and then the only requirement was you had to show up on a bicycle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was part of, are they still going, American Youth Hostels?
The American Youth Hostels are not going any longer, although in downtown Boston there's a whole headquarters called Hostel International, and that's...
Well, back in when I bicycled, I think back in the 70s, there were youth
there were youth hostels all over, yes.
The place, So then cars were taking over, right? They started taking over, and they started building roads like crazy. They were building roads everywhere they could try to build a road, and they destroyed a lot of the countryside with their road building. But there was some pushback, wasn't there? There were some people who said that we have to stop building roads. What happened?
Oh, yes.
Give us the whole story.
Well, if you think about the road building that was going on during the time, Massachusetts Turnpike, particularly the extension into Boston, and Route 128, all of these roads had a way of keeping people from their natural sort of recreational spots. And so they were very destructive in that way, not only to cyclists, but to others. And then the big move, of course, came when they tried to push through the Southwest Corridor Road all the way from Boston. It was going to go eventually out into Milton and Canton. Big neighborhood movement, really, to resist that.
Yeah. This is New England authors. We're speaking with Lorenz Finison, who's written 2 books about bicycling and bicycling history. And one of the books is called The Bicycling Renaissance. Now, I think you're referring to this period in between 1960 and 1971, where you say bicycling more than doubled from 35 million to 80 million. Is that the Renaissance that you're talking about?
That's the Renaissance, although I think the bicycling really started to ramp up with the concern about the environment. There had always been concern about physical health.
Yeah.
And in particular, in the 1950s and particularly 1950s, Paul Dudley White, a cardiologist, was very concerned about the importance of physical health in cardiology.
Right.
And he pushed bicycling as an exercise that would help to keep people healthy. And it didn't hurt that he was also Eisenhower's personal physician when Eisenhower had his heart attack. And a whole physical fitness movement developed. So there were some cyclists that were attracted that way. But when the environmental movement got going, particularly in 1970, things really began to take off because people could see how not only physical health, but also environmental health was going to be impacted by bicycling.
Right. Was there also kind of like a counterculture move, part of the counterculture movement of the 60s? Is on the front of your book is a picture of this place I'm going to talk about in a second, but it says "Stop the War," meaning the Vietnam War, right?
That was a sign on the front of the bike shop, and right. You're absolutely right. There was a kind of a confluence between environmentalism and kind of a political radicalism that was portrayed in that bike shop itself. And go ahead.
The bicycle shop is just half a mile from here, from our,
That's right.
From our door.
It's now called the Broadway Bicycle School, and it was called the Bicycle Repair Collective.
Right. And it was a joint, people went in there and repaired their bikes. I was in there in the 1970s to repair my bike, and have gone there, of course, many times since. So that's really boosted bicycling is the young people, mostly environmental movement.
Yes.
And it continued growing? Or
it continued growing, and many of those same people who started out in the early 1970s are still bicycling.
Like you and I.
Yes, and
right.
You'll find them in some of the bicycling clubs, you'll find are getting grayer and grayer as a result,
right.
because they've had a difficulty recruiting new members since younger people seem to be less likely to join formal organizations and clubs like that.
Although they bicycle.
They do, that's right.
Right. So tell us about this RailstoTrails. You talk about like the Cape Cod Trail and so on. When did that movement start?
Well, it started at various times, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, we began to get real interest in the whole idea of converting unused railroad beds to bikeways, to bike trails. And that's been going on now for 40 years. And every step of the way, it's been a real struggle because when a rail bed gets abandoned, what happens is the people who are the abutters, property owners who are abutting the rail line, begin to think of the rail bed as part of their backyard. Mm-hmm. And so it's a real struggle. It's always been a struggle to get them converted to actual rail trails.
But it doesn't seem like it costs a lot of money to do that.
It does, comparatively speaking, it does not cost a huge amount of money, or at least it shouldn't, to make that conversion because the bed is already there. Now, in some cases, bridges have washed away, and so you have to reconstruct a bridge, or parts of the roadway may have been taken over for other uses, and that means that the state has to go in and reclaim that land.
So, I mean, we're here in the Boston area, and there's a lot of bicycling here. There's a lot of bicycling in Portland, Maine, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Providence, Rhode Island, and Burlington. But in between spots, there isn't really. I mean, what do you say to people in rural New Hampshire? A lot of our folks are rural people. What do you say to them about bicycling? It's really hard to get to somewhere that's 10, 20 miles away.
Well, that's true. On the other hand, recreationally, people are very active in those areas, and not that they necessarily commute to work, but there are many racers who come from those areas too. I mean, there's a Northampton Cycling Club that maintains a very good existence, and a lot of people from the rural areas around Northampton are involved in that.
Yeah.
And there's a Berkshire Cycling Club as well. So the cycling clubs are scattered all over and have members from all over the New England area.
Yeah. So in the Boston area, Bicycling Magazine listed Boston as one of the worst cities to bicycle about, 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, it's gotten better.
It's much better now.
Yeah.
They've built so much infrastructure, and there's a lot of pushback from this, from motorists.
There's been a lot of pushback from motorists. There's also been some pushback from cyclists themselves. Because there's a certain grouping of cyclists who don't like the idea of separate bikeways
Right.
for cyclists. They'd rather be on the road and sort of claim the road themselves. And so there's been a lot of argument about that over the years.
Yeah. Yes. So tell us about my friend Carl Kurtz and the Bikes Not Bombs.
Well, he was a great interviewee for me.
Yeah.
And it's a great story to tell about Bikes Not Bombs and how it developed as a way of supporting and helping the Sandinista government in
Nicaragua.
Yeah. In terms of helping to get health workers around to treat people who'd been injured in the wars there. And to supplant transportation that had been so decimated by the oil embargo and the mining of their harbor and whatnot. So this was all a support exercise, and tremendous number of people gave bikes, a lot of times old bikes, to Bikes Not Bombs, where they got repaired and then shipped down to Nicaragua.
They got shipped to Nicaragua. And since that time, they've been going since the Reagan era. So they've shipped many containers of bikes to African countries and poorer countries around the world. A wonderful organization.
And I think one other aspect, just to say, and that is one of the things they've done is really bring in young people and train them to be bike mechanics.
Yes.
So there's this kind of a pathway there, even to leadership in the organization.
Yeah.
From the youngest ages. So that's been a really positive thing that they've done.
Okay, so what's the future now of New England bicycling?
Well, I would say that it's changing. And I think that it's changing because of the demographics of the population are getting older. So you're getting the development of things like e-bikes, which are essentially electronic assist bikes. In fact, one of the organizations that I belong to has a group of more retired people who are biking, and the leader of that group actually rides an e-bike so she can get herself up the hills. But then that's one of the pieces of the future.
Yeah.
You're going to see a lot of different types of bikes develop for people of varying degrees of ability and disability. I think that's going to develop more in the future.
Okay, yeah. And what infrastructure would you like to see?
Well, I think there's going to be more infrastructure in terms of bike lanes and bike paths in the cities. I think that's for sure. And bike trails, the RailstoTrails conversion continues on. The hope, for example, is that the old Central Mass Railroad, which went all the way from Northampton to Boston. That rail trail will be completed.
Yeah.
I hope in my lifetime.
Yes.
Another branch will go all the way from Northampton down to New Haven.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what a wonderful trip that would be of several hundred miles to go all the way from Boston to New Haven and back again.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. That would be. There are a number of rides, and there are many charity rides, right? There are a lot of for AIDS and for cancer.
Over the years, they've developed the Pan Mass Challenge.
Yes.
For cancer.
They raise a ton of money.
They raise a lot of money. The AIDS rides from the 1980s and 1990s raised a lot of money, and those continue on. There are a whole variety of charitable rides that are going on to this day.
Well, Larry Finison, it's really been good to have you on the show. What's your next project?
Well, I've got a third book in the works, which is kind of an expansion. It's called Pedaling Towards Inclusion. It's an expansion of what I've worked on here, and I've got a whole, really nice chapter, I think, on the history of women's road racing in it, particularly focused on the New England area, and how women developed in Vermont and as cross-country skiers, and then their coaches said to them, hey, you need to cross-train in the off-season. So they got into bike racing. And there's a whole story around that I love to tell.
Well, I'll be looking forward to seeing that. It's really wonderful to have you on the show. This is New England Authors. We're recording here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and broadcasting on about 40 stations around the region. And if you missed any episode, go to YouTube, and remember, watch locally.